Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Thinking Theologically, the show where we teach you how and why you should think theologically. I'm one of your hosts, Jack Dodge, and joined as always by the resident master theologian in training, Spencer Shaw. And I said that very well this time, so fast. It just rolled right off the tongue. The last episode, we talked about which Bible translation you should use. This episode's a little bit more standalone. But I would encourage you to open your preferred translation to the book of Romans, because we're going to give an overview of Romans, or overview in the sense of when you open to that book and when you're reading through it, there are some things that you need to be on the lookout for, some things that you need to be aware of. And Spencer today is going to walk us through 4 of those keys that he's identified in reading Romans. So we'll just jump right into the first of our 4 keys here: Jews and Gentiles. Spencer, what do we need to know about Jews and Gentiles in Romans? Maybe that's different from the other New Testament letters, where we might have Jews and Gentile stuff
Yeah.
going on too.
Yep.
Take it away.
So, like you said, the New Testament is filled with these issues of Jews versus Gentiles. But before I talk about that, I want to kind of set the stage a little bit by first kind of where this topic came from.
Sure.
So, Romans is seen by a lot, both lay Christian and scholars alike, as kind of Paul's magnum opus,
Hmm.
right? The one of the uh, best, grandest letters that Paul wrote, and maybe one of the best and grandest letters that we have in all of the New Testament. It's filled with all kinds of things. People like going to Romans, and that's not something that's just modern. People have loved Romans throughout church history. So it's an important book. Theology, a lot of theologies are based heavily on things found in Romans. So I think understanding Romans is a key in New Testament theology and Pauline theology, so understanding Paul. And I think it's an important book. And I was given some lectures a few weeks before this recording, which is going to be like a month by the time it comes out. But part of that was talking about what Paul's doing in Romans. And so that just got me thinking of, well, maybe let's do an episode that kind of helps us think about the book of Romans. And in this regard, I want to recommend a book that kind of influences a lot of what we're going to talk about. Not everything, but a lot of kind of my thoughts on Romans. It's a little book. It's not very big. It's a small little thin book called When in Romans by Beverly Gaventa. She's a New Testament Pauline scholar, and she just kind of highlights, when you're in the book of Romans, here's some things to pay attention to. And it's just kind of a real brief introduction that kind of helps understand the book. And so some of where I'm coming from is influenced by her work. I got to hear her lecture on the topic several years ago. It's been a while now, 5-6 years ago now, but just a great New Testament Pauline scholar. With that being said, Jews and Gentiles in Romans. So this is an important place to start in thinking about Romans, because I would argue that the primary purpose of the letter is to deal with tensions that exist in the Roman church between Jews and Gentiles. And I think understanding it in this way makes sense on 2 levels. First, I think it makes sense on a textual level. So, this is what I mean by that. However, we want to understand the purpose of Romans, and there's more than one way to understand why Paul wrote Romans, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Paul can be trying to do
Hmm.
multiple things in one letter. And so there's a lot of possibilities for why he wrote the letter, and throughout history and in scholarship, there are many different ways that people have understood why this letter was written. For example, some people have argued that it's kind of a systematic theology, Paul laying out in very deep terms his theology. I don't think that's the main point, but I think that's something that he does in Romans. So if you compare like Galatians and Romans, there's a lot of overlap. Romans is almost an extension of Galatians. It's written more towards the end of Paul's ministry. So I definitely think you see a development of the way that Paul is thinking about the same themes that he wrote in Galatians at the beginning of his ministry. And so I do think you see some of that. Some see it as a last will and testament, so kind of a last thing that Paul is doing before he is eventually executed. Some think that it's in self-introduction. So Romans is written to the church in Rome that Paul did not establish and a church he has not been to. Now he knows people at this church, but he hasn't been there. He didn't establish it. So some think he's introducing himself because he says in the letter that he desires to hopefully
Mm.
one day go to Rome. And so those are some possibilities. But and there's others, but however we want to understand the purpose of the letter, this is what I would argue. It has to make sense of chapters 9 through 11. These are the chapters where Paul speaks about the Gentiles being grafted in to Israel, grafted in to the people of God. And far too often, I know this is the way that I heard Romans preached and taught growing up, and seems to be an assumption of a lot of people that I talk to still today. It seems that for most, these chapters are understood as a side note by
Mm.
Paul. So Paul is giving a systematic theology. He's doing this, he's doing that, and he just pauses briefly in chapters 9 through 11 to talk about Gentiles being grafted in, which is not his main point. And then maybe in chapter 12, he gets back to his main point with some application about how the Romans are to go and live. But I think that if you just read through the letter and you kind of put aside your thoughts about Romans, if you just read chapter 1 through chapter 16, naturally, I think it becomes fairly obvious that these chapters are not an aside by Paul, but rather the pinnacle of the letter, the section which the previous chapters are leading to. So that chapters 1 through 8 are leading us in to Paul being able to say what he does in chapters 9 through 11. And then chapters 12 through 15, which is what you could call an application portion, what the Romans are to do, I think naturally flows out of what he says in verses 9 through 11. And so, in other words, if the primary purpose of Romans is to deal with issues between Jews and Gentiles, chapters 9 through 11 now makes a whole lot more sense. It makes sense that that would be what the letter is building up to, because it's all about Gentiles being grafted in to the people of God. It's about the relationship between Israel and the Gentiles and what that means in light of what Jesus has done. I think the primary purpose being to deal with Jews and Gentiles also makes sense on a historical level. So Romans was likely written sometime in the mid to late 50s, so 55 to 58 CE. Prior to that, in the year 49, the Jews were expelled from Rome by Emperor Claudius. Claudius dies in 54, and so 5 years later, Claudius dies. When Claudius dies, the Jews are allowed to enter back into Jerusalem, and all of this, the Jews entering back in 54 is right before Romans is written in 55 through 58, within a year to 3-4 years between the Jews entering back in and Paul writing this letter. And I want you to think just for a moment about what those dynamics might be. We can probably imagine that the Roman church was established by Jews, as most churches in the ancient world were, because Christianity began as a Jewish movement before it spread to Gentiles. So if you think of most Christian communities were probably Jew established. And so if you imagine that Rome was established by Jews and then Gentiles get brought into this community, the founding members would be Jews. Likely the leaders in the church would also have been
Mhm.
Jews who were a part of the founding. When they get kicked out, a church that began as a Jewish church, then becomes made up of Jew and Gentile, now becomes solely a Gentile congregation for a period of 5 years, which means that these Gentiles that are left, they're now having to enter into the leadership roles and lead and maintain this Christian community. After those 5 years pass and the Jews are allowed to enter back into Jerusalem, you can imagine maybe some of the founding Jews, maybe some of those that were leaders before, enter back into Rome. They want to enter back into this church and probably take back the role that they had that's now being filled by a Gentile.
Mm.
And all of that is also taking place in an early church where, if you read through the New Testament, there's a lot of questions, and Paul deals with this a lot, about how the Israelite people relate to the Gentiles in light of what Jesus is doing in creating these new communities. So there's already tension in the early church between Jews and Gentiles, and the Jews being kicked out of Rome and allowing back in probably just helps to heighten these problems. And so historically, it makes sense that these things are major issues that Paul is trying to address, which is why the letter builds in through to 9 through 11, which explains how Jews and Gentiles relate to each other. But also, in understanding it that way, just makes more sense of the text, right? From a literary perspective, it seems, if you just read through it, that Paul is trying to lead in to 9 through 11. And so, how we interpret the letter has to be in the context of Paul is dealing with these tensions between Jews and Gentiles, and in a way that sees chapters 9 through 11 as the pinnacle, or the climax that the letter leads into, and then the end kind of flows back out of.
The 9 to 11 footnote idea, which, by the way, 3 full chapters being a footnote as an idea is pretty crazy. Uh, you wouldn't have a footnote that long. But that's been my experience too. First of all, just that Romans is a beloved book. I get asked that one all the time. It's Revelation and Romans. Revelation is because it's so weird. Romans is, man, this book is just so good, and so there's just so much. And please, but that idea, that sentiment around 9 through 11 is same thing that I've experienced. There's a couple difficult things in there, I know, that people would rather avoid, trying to figure out about the whole Israel and them coming to believe. And I can't remember which chapter exactly that's in, but it's in that discussion. And so that one gets ignored. But to your point about leading up to that, when you start Romans, or at least the second half of chapter 1, which is typically used apologetically in my experience. The creation points to, therefore you're without excuse. But then you roll right into the next chapter of, well, if they're without excuse, then you, and it's okay, we're dealing with two audiences of people here: those that didn't have the law but had creation, and those that had more than the creation but weren't living that way. uh, that's very much a Jew Gentile thing, and it's similar to me like the Ephesians when he's talking about the heavenlies in the opening chapter, and then chapter 6 happens over here, and it's really just breadcrumbs up to that point. That's what he wants to talk about. He really wants to deal with this issue, but we can't get there yet because there's some other stuff. Well, he really wants to get to 9 to 11 and deal with this problem, but we got to do some other things along the way first. But yeah, definitely don't ever look at, and Paul gets this all the time because he can have run-on sentences or sometimes interject ideas that feel like they're a step removed from what he's been talking about. What Paul's doing is on purpose. Understand his flow of thought, but what he's doing is on purpose. And 9 through 11 is certainly not something that you should pay less attention to while you're going through the book. The history stuff is interesting too. I don't think I knew that. Uh, that's certainly a added twist to the normal Jew Gentile tensions that existed within the church. To have a position, lose that position, come back to that position as a potential possibility of things going on is something I think some people can relate to, that might be listening to this.
Yeah, and you think about, like, in 9 through 11, there's this people today there's the conversation of, people will talk about who the true Israel is,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't like that language, 'cause I'm not quite sure that that's quite as simple as what Paul's trying to make. But if you think about Israel there as more than Israel, but you're talking about the people of God, then, you know, if there is some leadership dispute, you could see Jews saying, well, almost Gentiles are second rate people of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe I need to be in charge. And Paul's like, well, No, they're not. And that's kind of encapsulated in this greater Jew Gentile problem that takes up a lot of the New Testament of there's some superiority there that it seems that Jews feel sometimes. And I think you even see that in, Paul, I think in 118 through the end of chapter 1 is kind of dealing with Gentile sinfulness. And then I think he turns to Jews in chapter 2 when he's like, you are judging these people, but how can you do it when you do
Hmm.
the same thing? So I think there is some superiority there, and that might even fit into some leadership disputes and dynamics that because of this historical thing may be going on. We don't know that for sure, but it's likely that that caused some kind of conflict within this greater New Testament conflict between who makes up the people of God.
Yeah, whatever you're reading within a letter is all going to have flow of thought together. So there is absolutely something prior to 9 through 11 that is setting the stage for the conversation in 9 through 11, and you should just regard Romans like you do every other book of what's happening between opening to closing, and how do all those pieces fit together. Okay, so we have the Jew Gentile issue, and what specifically may be going on there as the first key. The second key, the righteousness of God, which this is an interesting one because the idea of righteous or justified righteousness, all of these things, is one of those. It's one of the big church words and can mean different
Hmm.
things depending on the author and depending on how it's translated as well from an interpretive standpoint, as we spent a few episodes talking about. So, what do we need to know about the righteousness of God in Romans?
Yeah, so like you said, the term righteousness is this church word that we use, and I'm not sure we know what it means. Um, I think that's true with a lot of church words. And maybe this is just kind of the preacher in me cautioning anybody else who's preaches or teaches, but we throw out words like righteousness, justice, repentance, kingdom, community, church, as if we're all on the same page with what these words mean. And I guarantee you the most of the people in pews either can't give a definition if you ask them, or if they do, it's not in the Bible at all. And I think that's almost the same with some preachers, and I'm not saying that in a negative way, but I wonder if we just throw out these buzzwords because we're like, "Hey, we're all gonna be on the same page if we need to be a community," and we don't think about, well, what does that mean? Like defining, what do
Mhm.
I mean when I say that? Or God is righteous. What do I mean when I say that? And the same is true for Paul. So in Romans, the thesis. So this is the point that Paul is making. This is what Romans is about. Is chapter 1 verses 16 and 17, where he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith," or to everyone who believes. Pistis, same word in Greek. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, or from faith for faith, or there's some other ways that that can be translated. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. So, this is what Paul says the purpose of the letter is. It's to expound upon the good news, the euangelion, the gospel, that God has offered salvation to everyone who has faith. That's the good news, that everyone who has faith, God has offered this salvation to them, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. There's the Jew Gentile
Mhm.
relationship, once again, which I think is the context for which Paul is writing. And first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. I think that simply means that salvation first came to the Jews and through the Jews, in other words, Jesus and the early church, and then it's spread now to the Gentile world. So first to the Jew and then to the Gentile, this good news of salvation to all who have faith has come. And Paul is not ashamed of this good news. There might be some shame. Maybe he's dealing with something specific in his community. Maybe it's because he's writing to Rome and claiming that Jesus is the new king. And he's saying, and so he's writing to the center of the Roman Empire and claiming that somebody else is actually the true king. And so it might be well, I'm not ashamed to proclaim this even in
Mm.
Rome. That could be a part of it as well. But whatever's going on there. Paul says that he is not ashamed of this good news because it reveals God's righteousness, or it reveals the righteousness of God. This is, I meant to bring my Greek Bible in here with me, and I didn't, but I did look it up before we did this. It says, "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed." That is dikaiosune gar theou. So gar is for, that moves to the beginning of the sentence. So it's literally righteousness for of God. So for the righteousness of God is revealed in this good news. Now, since Martin Luther in particular, Protestants have tended to interpret the phrase the righteousness of God as imputed righteousness. That is, that God's righteousness is imputed, or it is given to those who have faith. So it's read that the good news of salvation is that God, who is righteous, has given us his righteousness. And so it's God giving us the righteousness. And that is a possible way to render the Greek. So it can be translated as God's righteousness that is given to us. And if that's Paul's point, in other words, if Paul's point is to say, is to describe the good news of salvation, where we can see the righteousness that God has given to us, then the point of Romans is our personal salvation. And I'm not convinced that if Romans is all about how I, as an individual, receive God's righteousness and end up in heaven, I'm not sure how chapters 9 through 11 fit into that.
Mm.
And so if 9 through 11 is the central part of the letter, is the thing that Paul wants to say, then I don't think the letter can be primarily about it. It's not that Paul doesn't talk about individual salvation, but I don't think that the letter can primarily be about individual salvation if we want 9 through 11 to be the central argument of the letter. And so, a better way to understand the phrase, and another way that the Greek can be translated, is to say that Paul is saying that the good news reveals the reality that God is righteous. And so, instead of interpreting it like, in the good news, God has given us his righteousness, it's in the good news, we see that God is righteous. So, God's righteousness, I think, is a better way to understand that. And I think Paul wants us to understand what it means for God to be righteous in two ways. And I steal this from N.T. Wright, which, if you listen to other episodes, you're not surprised that I'm stealing something from N.T. Wright. But I think he makes a solid argument in this case that Paul is trying to show that God is righteous in two ways. First, that God is righteous in a covenant sense. So God has been righteous to the covenant that he made with Abraham. If you remember, God promised Abraham that he would have a multi-ethnic family, and through this family, the entire world would be blessed. So God needs to be righteous in a covenant sense in fulfilling those promises to Abraham. But Wright argues that in the Greco-Roman world, righteousness also had a law court idea. And so God needs to be righteous in terms of like justice and law. And particularly in Romans, Wright sees that as taking the form of sin, that God has to be righteous to deal with the problem of sin. Now, the issue is that both of these two things are kind of in conflict, right? God's made this promise to Abraham. By the way, Abraham, or this importance of Abraham in Paul's argument, is greatly undervalued
Mm.
in Romans. But God has to fulfill this covenant to Abraham, multi-ethnic people to bless the entire world. The problem is that everybody is sinners. And so, how does God, as a just God, deal with the problem of sin while also fulfilling the covenant to Abraham. These two things are kind of contradictory. And so Wright would argue that the point that Paul is making is to show that God is righteous and has been able to do both things. He's been able to fulfill the covenant to Abraham, and he has been able to deal with the problem of
Hmm.
sin. And if that's the way we understand this phrase, the righteousness of God, that makes a lot of sense out of chapters 9 through 11 because Paul begins by speaking how God has dealt with the problem of sin for both Jews and Gentiles. So 118 all the way through the end of chapter 8, I would argue, is Paul talking about this sin problem. How in Jesus has God dealt righteously with the problem of sin? And we're going to talk about this in the last point. He deals with it first on an individual level. How has Paul dealt with us as individuals and our individual sin? But also, how has God, through Jesus, dealt with cosmic sin? So, this force of sin that exists in the world. And once Paul has talked about, okay, God has dealt with the problem of sin, he can now move on in 9 through 11 to talk about the second part, and maybe the part that he wants to get to about God's righteousness is how has God been righteous to the covenant with Abraham in relation to sin and to the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. And so he has to begin with the sin thing. That's out of the way. And so now God can be righteous to the covenant with Abraham. How has God done that in relation to both Jews and Gentiles? And then that takes center stage in chapters 9 through 11, which, as I said, I think is the whole point of what Paul is trying to make. But he has to deal with the sin problem first. And once we get through chapter 11, God's been righteous in both accounts. He's dealt with the problem of sin and he's fulfilled the covenant that he has made with Abraham of this multi ethnic family and this blessing to the entire creation.
Yeah, which then gets you into the chapter 12 of, all right, so then I need to be transformed, live according to him and his way of doing things because he is righteous. Know that through the gospel. That so all those pieces come together in the application section, which it is. There's also application other play. That's whatever. But that's where all that comes together. I'm with you on that. I really don't have any additions other than I would encourage listeners as they're going through Romans to, and you should be mostly fine on the English side of things. Blue Letter Bible is helpful about this if you don't know Greek super well, which that includes me, by the way. I was very happy when you said dikaiosune, and I'm like, I know what that word is because it's been a while. So I'm glad I remember my vocab. But you can use like Blue Letter Bible as a good resource for looking for the occurrences of righteousness and faith throughout your Roman studies, and you'll see a lot of righteousness and unrighteousness. Faith, belief would be thrown in there as well, but we'll have more to say about that in just a bit.
Let me add
Yeah.
something to that as well. The term, and this might help you when you're reading through, the term righteousness, justice,
Hmm.
justification. All of those are the same Greek
Yeah.
word. They all come from dikaiosune is the noun form of it. And the reason is because justification it typically functions as a verb, whereas righteous and righteousness tend to function as nouns because we don't really have English doesn't really have a verb for righteous. You don't righteous somebody or something like that's not the way that English works. And so justification and justify kind of become which is kind of weird because righteousness, justification are typically what you do when you make a verb into a noun. So justification is a noun, but it's making the verb to justify and
Hmm.
functioning as a noun, if that makes sense. That's just the way that the English language works. But because of the way that English works, we needed a noun and a verb to translate this one word that shows up in both ways. And so righteous tends to be the noun, justified tends to be the verb. So just those two things are the same thing. So when Paul talks about God justifying somebody, that can also be translated God makes that person righteous, for example, or whatever the context.
Well, and then with faith too, faith, belief, sometimes trust as well. You're going to get with pistis, just how it's translated. We'll get multiples.
I like the term allegiance personally. And I steal that a little bit from N.T. Wright. And I think Scott McKnight would probably agree with that because McKnight's big thing is kingdom and Jesus is king. And so faith, I think, carries more of an idea of allegiance
Yeah,
because allegiance is belief and action get brought together, I think, better than faith. It tends to be an intellectual thing, belief and intellectual thing, but it's an intellect that leads to. So I tend to like allegiance is a better
yeah,
translation for
yeah.
pistis, but
Okay, so coming off the heels of righteousness and faith word discussion, now we're into faith in Jesus versus the faithfulness of Jesus. You already kind of alluded to this when you read the Romans 1:16-17 thesis of faith to faith,
mhm,
faith from faith, for faith. You can translate those words multiple ways, and if you open up some commentaries on Romans or listen to discussions on Romans, there's normally a lot of discussion about this particular
yeah,
word and that phrase there in the opening chapter and how it's what it means for the rest of the book, because
mhm.
it does mean something for the rest of the book. So faith in Jesus versus faithfulness of Jesus, what does that mean? What do we need to be on the lookout for with those phrases?
As you said, there's this phrase that's translated into English, faith in Jesus, that shows up not just throughout Romans, but throughout Paul's letters. And so this is something else that's connects not just to Romans, but kind of throughout when you're reading
Hmm.
Paul's letters. And this phrase, faith in Jesus, in Greek is pistis Iesu. And Iesu, Jesus, is in what is called the genitive case in Greek. And here's the reason I say that is because that genitive can be translated either as an objective genitive, that is, Jesus is the object of faith. So my faith in Jesus as the object. It can also be translated as a subjective genitive. So the faithfulness of Jesus. Now we're talking about Jesus' faith. And those are two different ways with two very different meanings. Are we talking about my faith in Jesus or are we talking about Jesus' faith? And I, along with the majority of scholars, think that the best way to translate those words is not as my faith in Jesus, but as speaking about the faithfulness of Jesus himself. And I want to give you an example of why this makes sense. And because to me, the primary reason this makes sense is if Paul is talking about my faith in Jesus when he uses this phrase, then he repeats himself a lot. And if he is talking about Jesus' faithfulness, I think it fits the contexts that he uses this a lot more. So in Romans chapter 3, beginning in verse 21, this is what Paul says. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by the law and the prophets. So Paul is kind of now expounding upon that thesis statement. We're back to the righteousness of law being shown. He says it's now been shown apart from the law. Verse 22, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ. There's that phrase, pistis Iesu, through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe or all who have faith. Now, I want you to listen to that. The righteousness of God through, if we're talking about my faith, through my faith in Jesus Christ for all of us who have faith. So that's Paul's repeating
Hmm.
himself. He's saying that the righteousness of God has been shown through my faith in Jesus for people like me who have faith. That's kind of a repeat right after each other. Doesn't make a lot of sense. What would make more sense is to read it that the righteousness of God has been shown through the faithfulness of Jesus. So we have seen God's righteousness through Jesus' faith to come to earth, live a perfect life, die on the cross, rise from the grave. That event of Jesus' faithfulness has shown us the righteousness of God, and that is benefited from for all people who have faith, for all people who display the same kind of faith that is seen in the life and ministry of Jesus. If this is how we choose to translate it, it also makes a lot more sense of that thesis statement in 116 and 17. So, something that's confused a lot of people is when Paul says, "For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith." Well, what in the world does through faith for faith mean? Well, if in places in like 322, we choose to translate that genitive subjectively, so the faithfulness of Jesus benefited from by those who have faith, then what Paul is saying in verse 17 is that the righteousness of God has been revealed through the faithfulness of Jesus for the benefit of those who have faith. And that same kind of thing can be traced throughout Paul's letters. And so, some modern translations, I know my NRSV does, it has a footnote that says that that could be translated the faithfulness of Jesus.
Hmm.
And so, throughout Paul's letters, I think consistently the best way, if you see that phrase, faith in Jesus, Paul is probably not talking about our faith, but talking about Jesus' faith.
Um, so thinking about that too, and I know that this is you're using 322 as an example, but if you finish out that chapter and then move into the next one, we have faith of Abraham and showing that as a like what he's doing and his following after God and the faith that he shows in all of this and how that's up it's not dismissing the law, which is what the end of chapter 3 is all about. So you get this faithfulness of Jesus followed by faithfulness of Abraham. That's Paul making his arguments and dealing with those issues that you talked about in the last point here, the last key that we had. So that tends to make a lot of sense. And 322 is a good place to go because of, yeah, that would be really repetitive. Does Paul repeat himself sometimes? Yeah, absolutely, throughout the course of a book. But to say the same thing in the same faith in Jesus and for those of us who have faith in Jesus makes very little sense. Um, and it's better to look at, as he does throughout a lot of his writing, the faithfulness of Jesus to what God has laid out. So
Mhm.
that this is a good, I think, example of what we talked about in some of our previous episodes of translators are doing interpretive work as well, and so paying attention to words like faith and those little tiny words of in, of, and for, how all of those things can be translated different ways, to spend a little time with those that don't take them for granted and just go, ah, well, that's what it says because that's what's here. Well, it could say a lot of things. Stop and think about
Mhm.
it for a while. Okay, last key, smallest key, shortest key. I don't know that either small key works. I don't know. Are keys shorter or small? The illustration is breaking down for me. I'm sorry. We've talked about this before in a previous episode to some degree. The capital S sin, the lowercase sin, all that. The cosmic sin key. And speaking of a little word and how it's used, the word sin,
Mhm.
where we definitely have something we think of when we hear that word. What should we think about in Romans when sin comes up?
In Romans, sin is not just individuals missing the mark. That's what we tend to think of,
Mhm.
right? So sin is when you or I do something that we shouldn't do. That's one way to think about sin. And that's one way that I think Paul thinks about sin in Romans. But in Romans, sin is also a cosmic force that does things and works through, particularly, I think, power structures in the world to influence us. And that's where you get what we've talked about before, little s, lowercase s, sin, which is you and I missing the mark, versus thinking of big S or capital S, sin, in terms of this cosmic force. Now, that's important because, as I said, if one of the things Paul's trying to do is show God to be righteous to the covenant to Abraham by drawing in the Gentiles, right? Jew Gentile relationship. If that's Paul's point, But to do that, Paul has to show how God has been righteous to deal with the problem of sin. So sin is also kind of it's secondary but central, if that makes sense, because Paul has to talk about that to get to the Abraham thing. And so it's secondary but also central to the letter. If that's what's going on, then we have to kind of understand what Paul means when he talks about sin. And he talks about it, I think, and I take this from Beverly Gaventa, there's like connecting circles, and Paul deals with sin on an individual level, and then he deals with it on a cosmic level, and there's some connection between these two ideas to show how God has dealt with all of sin through Jesus, and then he kind of moves on to the where he wants to go in God's righteousness to the covenant with Abraham. I want to show you just an example of kind of how this works. So, if you went to the beginning of Romans, where I think Gaventa is correct that Paul is dealing with sin on a more individualistic level, you get like beginning in chapter 1 and verse 18, Paul is dealing with sin among Gentiles, I think. And he says, and these are words that we're familiar with that Jack mentioned earlier, ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made, so they were without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. God talks about giving them over to the lusts of their heart, giving them over to their degrading passions, right? That's individual things, right? People chose, or groups of people chose. It doesn't have to be like one person. It can be individual as in like communal. But they gave up the worship of God. They gave in to the lust of their hearts. They gave in to their degrading passions. And then he has this list, and we might think of like works of the flesh from Galatians of envy, malice,
Hmm.
strife, deceit, craftiness, gossip, slander, God haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, all of those things. In chapter 2, I think Paul then moves on and looks at the Jews. And he's like, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others, for in passing judgment on others, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. So I think he's kind of turning to Jews who are like, yeah, Paul, you tell those Gentiles of all the horrible things that they've done. And then Paul turns to the Jews and is like, well, you can't judge them because you do the very same things. And that's where that builds into like Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory
Hmm.
of God, right? That's all very individual. Now, I want you to notice the difference in the way that Paul talks about sin in those chapters, 1, 2, 3, for example, very individual. Notice the way that he talks about sin in those chapters as compared to the way that he talks about sin, for example, beginning in the second half of chapter 12. So, in the second half of chapter 5. In chapter 5, beginning in verse 12, here's what Paul says. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned. Sin was indeed in the world before the law, but sin is not reckoned where there is no law. Yet death exercised dominion from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam, who is a type of the one who is to come. Notice some of that language. Sin came into the world. We're not talking about this thing
Hmm.
came into the world. Death came along with it, and it spread to all. It was in the world before the law, but we did not recognize that it was in the world. Death, this is what I want you to know. Death exercised
Hmm.
dominion. That's kingly rule. It's doing something over those who sin. So it's not removed from individual sin, but it sin has begun to take on a life of its own. This is a very different way of talking about sin than Paul has earlier in the letter. And then he moves on. Um, If, because of one man's trespass, death exercised dominion through that one, much more surely will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness exercise dominion in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. Verse 21, so that just as sin exercised dominion in death, so sin rules through the spreading of death, so grace might also exercise dominion through justification, leading to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. So sin, beginning there, Paul speaks about it as its own force, right? It does things. It comes into the world. It sets up a dominion. It exercises that dominion through death. It spreads that death to all people. And that's not Paul saying that we don't play a role in that, but that's a different way of talking about sin. And so I just want to say another way that we need to interpret it is we need to think about the fact that Paul talks about God's righteousness to deal with sin in two ways, both on an individual level, yes, but on this cosmic force of sin that does things in the world, causes things to happen, and rules and dominates over people through the force, through power structures, through things of that nature.
Yeah, and uh, this wouldn't be the only book where that kind of, well, even outside of just books where this is written. I think Paul does this in other places. I think you see this too, um, throughout the Jewish understanding of how evil works, that there's an individual thing that we do, but then there's also this thing from things from without and things that are just kind of doing their work behind the scenes. The language of the powers and authorities is very much this cosmic idea, the bigger idea, the thing behind the scenes idea, but that doesn't absolve our own personal accountability that is also discussed. So yeah, looking at those are good examples of how that language can shift. I remember in school when we were doing keyword or word study kind of things, we talked about having multiple buckets sometimes for your word, because yes, this one word might be used, but it's being used this way a few times and this way a few times and this way a few times. And so good exercise here, not just with Romans, but any book you read, the things that you are most familiar with, a word like faith, a word like sin, maybe a book you've read 100 times, is probably one you need to slow down the most with, because you're more likely to just plow right on through stuff that you've studied before so many times. Spend more time with that and go, man, am I really understanding this right? Is there something that I'm missing here? Is there something more going on than maybe what I've always been told or what I've always thought about this particular word or phrase or chapter or whatever it might be? Okay, next episode we're gonna go different directions, and Spencer will be in a very different place, just everywhere across the board, physically, emotionally. It's just everything's gonna shift,
Everything.
but between now and the next episode. So hope you tune in for that one when it comes out. Again, there might be a little shifting within the schedule, but hopefully won't have too much of that going on here. We've got some episode topics lined up, but we'd always love to hear from you about maybe thoughts that you'd have, things that you would like for us to cover, questions about things that we've covered in the past. You can let us know on our Facebook page or get a hold of us individually if you're friends with us or know us well, that kind of thing. Want to reach out that way, we'll pass that on to each other. But that does it for this episode on the 4 keys to reading Romans. I'm Jack. That's Spencer. We'll see you next time.